This seminar is for educational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment. Consult with your medical provider for medical advice or treatment. Although the presenters try to keep the information in this seminar as accurate and timely as possible, the speakers and Mather Hospital assume no duty to ensure the seminar is error-free. The speakers and Mather Hospital are not responsible or liable for any claim, loss, or damage resulting from you viewing this seminar. This seminar is for educational purposes only.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third in our Healthy Heart webinar series for American Heart Month. At any time during the presentation, please feel free to enter any questions you may have using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will answer as many questions as we can within the time allotted once the presentation concludes. Your questions will remain anonymous. Today's presenter is Dr. Rohan Pereira. Dr. Pereira is a cardiologist with Three Village Cardiology, a practice of Harborview Medical Services. He is a general cardiologist with special training in nuclear cardiology and has been in practice since 2000, when he came out of training from the internal medicine and cardiology programs at St. Luke's Roosevelt and Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center at Columbia University. Dr. Pereira?
Thank you, Stu. Good afternoon, everyone. So today's topic is heart disease and life over 50. I guess I should have renamed it Life Doesn't End at 50, but seeing as all the participants here are likely in the same group, what I'm trying to do here is look at the factors that affect cardiac health when you cross the 50 mark. So this first slide shows the changes that happen, physiological changes that happen in the body. There's a stiffening of the vessels, and there is a loss of relaxation of the muscle, and impaired response to adrenergic stimulation, which is basically ability to raise the heart rate. Can we go to the next slide, Stu? Next slide, please. So there are also other changes like impaired, no, go back one, please, Stu. Yes, there's a impaired relaxation. The slide after this.
After this, okay.
Okay, so anyway, we'll stay with this. There are changes in the tension of the muscle, the heart muscle, the muscles in the vessels, the impaired relaxation to adrenergic stimulation. But what makes a difference is that in the basic cardiac functioning, such as the cardiac output, the stroke volume, the ejection fraction, most of that is well preserved into very advanced age. The only difference is the ability to respond to increased demands, such as sudden stress, extreme exercise. That ability is impaired as people get older. And the aerobic capacity also declines with age. Next slide, please. All right, so before I go on, what I want to do is just look at the various aspects of the heart and point out the sources of which you can have problems from. So the heart is essentially a pump. It's all muscle with 4 valves in there, and it has an electrical conduction system as well as a vascular blood supply that brings oxygen to the heart. So you can have problems with the heart muscle. The commonest and probably the only really preventable one is coronary artery disease, also referred to as CAD. And when you get blockages in the blood vessels coming to the heart, you have a heart attack or angina, and that is treated with stents and bypasses. The heart muscle can also suffer from problems with weakness in the muscle itself, or from viruses or from toxins. That really is not preventable. That happens when it happens. You can treat it with medicines and improve the function and bring it back to normal. But when that problem happens, it really is not preventable. The valves are also the same. There are 4 valves in the heart. They are subject to wear and tear, and sometimes infections at a younger age, like rheumatic fever. And when the valves don't function, they prevent the blood from flowing in one direction, and that's the problem. But again, that's not really preventable except for preventing rheumatic fever as a child or treating it as soon as it happens. And we don't see that much in Northern Europe or Western, in the United States anymore. The final problem you can have with the heart is the conduction system, which is the electrical system. That's what gives you conditions like fibrillation, flutter, and heart block. Even these are really not preventable. So I want to come back to what I said right at the beginning. The really preventable aspect of heart disease is the coronary artery disease, which is very susceptible to changes in lifestyle. And if that doesn't work, treatment with medications. All right, next slide, please. Before I go further, I just want to clear up some terms that people use and maybe they don't, sometimes they misunderstand. I've heard people referring to sudden heart failure when they actually mean is a heart attack. Now, a heart attack is something that happens when there's a blockage to blood supply to the muscle. And that happens quite suddenly. But you do have a window of opportunity. It's anything up to 12 to 24 hours when you can go in and open up the blockage. And that gives you relief, and that can actually save your life, and that can save the heart function. That's a heart attack. Heart failure is different. It's a pump failure. That happens much more slow onset, and it happens over time. And the way you know you're having that is that the symptoms are difficulty with breathing, limitation to your exercise capacity, and things like that. But that normally does not happen overnight. Now, the real sudden event that people can have is a cardiac arrest, which is the event that has high mortality when it happens outside of a hospital. About 50% of the people survive that when you have a cardiac arrest. And that's because your heart either suddenly stops or goes into a really rapid arrhythmia, which it doesn't come out of. That's where you use the defibrillators and the electric shocks. And the last term there is stroke. And I hear people using the word stroke interchangeable with heart attacks. They're two different things. There is some commonalities, but a stroke is really a blockage of blood supply or a blood clot going to the brain and closing up the blood supply to a certain part of the brain. That manifests with weakness, loss of function, change in your speech pattern all of a sudden. There are a lot of common things between a stroke and a heart attack. For instance, you try to dissolve the blood clot, you try to remove the blood clot, and all of that, but they are two different entities. I just wanted to make that very clear. The next slide, please. Talk given last week by Dr. Gruberg, and he really went into detail about coronary artery disease, blockages in blood vessels. Just hold that for a sec. He went over that in detail about stents and valve replacements. I am not going to repeat all of that this time, and I'm going to move on to more to do with prevention, but I'm just going to go quickly through the definition. So this is coronary artery disease. You can see a narrowed blood vessel, and when that happens around the heart, it can lay you open to angina and heart attack. Next slide. So the same blockage that you can have in the heart can also happen in the carotid arteries, which are in your neck, which go to the brain. And if that becomes a problem, then you could have a stroke. Next slide. Now, the same blood vessels that you have going to your heart and to your brain also supply your extremities, and you can get blockages in those. That's referred to as peripheral vascular disease. That is also treated with stents by vascular surgeons, and that manifests as pain in your legs when you walk, and that's a blockage in the long blood vessels that go to the legs. Next slide. Organs, they also have a blood supply, and you can block that off, which is much less common. And then you get something that people refer to as abdominal angina. It's basically really bad stomach pains that come on after meals and things. And that is also treated with stenting and at special vascular centers. For us here right now, it would be either Northwell or Stony Brook. Next slide. Of a narrowed artery with a balloon, and then you widen the balloon, open up that blockage, and then put in a stent. So that the second picture is a picture of a stent. As I said, Dr. Gruberg went over this in great detail, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Next slide. you have too many blockages in your heart, or if they're in very critical places, stenting is a bit dangerous. So that's when you have a bypass. What you do with a bypass is you bypass the blockage. So if there's a blockage, you can see two bypasses there with a artery coming off a internal mammary, which is grafted onto the left anterior descending artery of your heart. And you see another bypass, which is a vein pass taken out of your legs, bypassing from the aorta onto the right coronary artery. So this is basically what bypass is all about. Next slide. All right, so I'm not going to go into coronary artery disease anymore right now, but if anybody has questions, I will answer questions on CAD, valves, bypass, stents, anything you want at the end of this talk. Now I'm going to go on to the prevention part. So here is the good news. That is, I think it's good news. The majority of you listening to this will probably not have coronary artery disease. The incidence over the age of 80 is only about 32%. So that leaves about 68 to 70% of people who would not have coronary artery disease. The next slide. So this is the incidence of myocardial infarctions, and I want you to understand the difference. So you can have a narrowing in your vessel, but not have a heart attack because it does not get blocked by a blood clot or doesn't get so bad that it completely blocks the vessel. In fact, there is a lot of evidence that you can have anything less than 70%, and if you keep your cholesterol down, it would regress. So as you can see, although 32% of people over 80 can have coronary artery disease, only about 17% will actually have a heart attack. And if you go to the younger age groups, between 60 and 79, it's 4.2% in women. And you go to the next age group, which is 40 to 59, it's very low both in men and in women. Particularly low in women because they're in the reproductive years, they have their hormones protecting them. So I just want to make it clear that the number of people having heart attacks is about half the number of people who have actual coronary artery disease. So it doesn't mean you're going to have a heart attack just because you have coronary artery disease. Next slide. So this is an interesting slide. It's a bit busy. I'm going to walk you through it. So you see 4 blue and red columns. And they're lettered A, B, C, and D. You look at the table below, and you have the 4 columns described again as A, B, C, and D. So what they have done here is they've taken a group of people 55 years and older and looked at them over a 10-year period and piled on the risk factors. These are all modifiable risk factors. There's blood pressure, cholesterol, good cholesterol, diabetes, and cigarette smoking. So in group A, my annotation here. Yeah, there we are. So group A, you notice that that group has normal blood pressure, normal cholesterol, high HDL, they don't smoke, and they don't have cigarettes. Look at the incidence of heart disease there. It's very low. And you could go to the extreme and take group D, which has high blood pressure, high cholesterol, low HDL, diabetes, and they also smoke. And then you get you coming up to that 37% CAD that I mentioned before. So this is where the modifiable risk factors matter. And this is how you can stay out, or if you've already had a stent or a bypass, prevent a second stent or bypass by attending to these. Can I have the next slide? All right, this is where I changed gears a little bit. I thought I'd make this talk a little interesting. This is a Honda Civic, the common variety you see on the roads. Next slide. This is the engine of a Honda Civic. You're wondering where I'm going with this. Next slide, please. This is a Ferrari Scuderia F136 for people who are interested in higher-end cars. Next slide. This is the engine of a F136 Ferrari. Next slide. All right, so this, let it run still. You might have to click a second time. Yeah, there it is. So that's an internal combustion engine, which was first invented in the late 1800s. And this is the engine up until the recent battery-driven cars became available. This is the engine that drives all our cars, okay? There is a piston, and there's a cylinder in which the piston rests, and there are minor explosions in that little tube that comes into the cylinder where the gasoline is ignited by electric spark. That causes a small explosion inside the cylinder. It drives the piston down, which drives the camshaft, and then when it cools, the cylinder moves up. In a 4-cylinder car, there's 4 of them. In a 6-cylinder, there is 6, 3 up and 3 down. And you can keep working up the V8s, V12s. It's all that same. It's the same internal combustion engine, and this is what keeps these cars running. Next slide, please. All right, so these are the details of the engines of the 2 cars I just showed you. The Honda Civic engine weighs 309 pounds. It has about 2 liters of volume in it. It's got 4 cylinders. It can reach about 180 horsepower. It does 32 miles per gallon, and it has a 20-year lifespan, or 300,000 miles. I got this off some car magazine. The Ferrari Scuderia Spider weighs almost 2,500 pounds, or 1,290 kilograms. It's a 4.7-liter engine with 8 cylinders and can reach 503 horsepower. But it has a shorter lifespan of 5 to 7 years. This is average lifespan. I know people have cars they've had for years, but this is the average lifespan in the auto book. It needs maintenance of about $3,000 to $7,000 a year. Next slide. This is the little motor that we all have inside our chest walls. It's a 4-chambered structure. I'm waiting for this thing to load. The heart is a 4-chambered structure, as I've told you already. It does a lot more than just pump blood, all right? It takes blood with low oxygen from the right side, comes into the right ventricle, gets pumped into the pulmonary circulation, comes back through the pulmonary veins with full of oxygen, and it's pumped to the rest of the body. The heart is self-regulating. The heart is self-repairing and needs no maintenance. Next slide. Yes, this is a human heart. It weighs about 12 ounces. It has about 1/3 of a liter of fluid in it. It has no cylinders. It has 4 valves, can reach about 1.2 horsepower, but it has a 78-year lifespan of continuous use. Think about that. I drive my car to work for 15 to 20 minutes. It stays in the parking lot. Then I get into it and go home and drive another 15 to 20 minutes. And it's in the garage at night. Most of your cars are the same. My heart beats all the time when I'm on the treadmill, when I'm at work, when I'm annoyed with people, when I'm asleep. So it's continuous use and it needs no maintenance. 7 to 8 years is the average lifespan of an American today. And that's how powerful this machine is. Next slide. So this is tar sands. It's the crudest form of oil as it comes out of the ground. So you've got to ask yourself, if you have one of those fine cars like a Honda Civic or a Ferrari, would you put this in the gas tank? Or would you actually put premium? I mean, that's a rhetorical question because I know what people would do. Next slide. So if you do that for the car that you drive, and you have such a sophisticated, maintenance-free, self-repairing, self-regulating machine inside your chest wall, why would you stuff it full of this kind of stuff? Next slide. All right, so this is an article that appeared recently in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. This is a map of the world with 5 places in the world where the average population is significantly over the age of 80. And they have the largest collection of centenarians, people 100 years or older. There's only one of the towns that actually is inside the States, and that's Loma Linda in California. There's Nicoya in Costa Rica, Sardinia in Italy, Icaria in Greece, which is world famous for the people living extremely long lives, and Okinawa in Japan, which is the longest known enclave of people who live well over 100 years and remain fully functional with all their faculties intact. Next slide, please. So as I said, this is an article just came out a week or two ago. So the scientists and the researchers are curious as to how these people in these little enclaves manage to live so long and preserve such good health. There are certain factors which are genetic, which obviously cannot be modified. Your genes are your genes, what you're born with. Maybe someday with gene therapy, but not yet. And then there are certain qualities of the soil itself. And I want to make it clear that there have been theories about magnesium in the soil and zinc. None of that has been proven, but there are theories. Putting those aside, I want to focus on the modifiable risk factors, which is this box over here. These people do, in those countries, do different things different from us. Just think of that bucket of tar sands in your heart. They have the Mediterranean diet. The Japanese have their raw fish diets, and they're generally low-calorie intake diets. Big emphasis on exercise. I don't know if anyone of you has been to those little villages in Italy. You see people climbing mountains with their week's shopping and very few cars on the streets. Smoking cessation, and certain elements that they use for anti-inflammatory properties, which nobody has properly quantified yet. But pay attention to the modifiable lifestyle and behavioral things here to do with diet, low-calorie exercise, and smoking cessation. Next slide, please. Yeah, next. All right, so I'm going to start with what exercise does. And, you know, this is, I think everybody on this webinar knows that exercise is good for you, but I think people don't realize how it modifies and improves every little aspect of your biology and your function. And this is again an article from a medical journal, and shows how exercise improves the functioning at a cellular level in the heart, in the blood vessels, and it changes the blood cholesterol parameters. It increases the good cholesterol and it lowers the bad cholesterol. It increases insulin sensitivity, so that tendency to diabetes is a lot less. It increases blood formation. All of this is through exercise. And then in the blood vessels, that's the middle column, you'll see that it actually regresses plaque formation. It regresses calcification on the valves. That's to do with the valve problems. It increases relaxation, dilatation of the vessels, and lowers the resting blood pressure. There's this one thing I want to point out here, that's shear stress. So when you're exercising a lot, it does increase the speed and the velocity of the blood flow, and the laminar flow, that the pattern it has becomes a bit more stressful for the vessels, but your vessels relax to accommodate it, so it really doesn't damage your body. Next slide. So this has been quantified, and I want to go through this a little bit. So these are studies that have been done, and they've taken people who do routine daily exercise throughout their life form. That's the first row. And you can see here that their blood pressure goes down by 8 millimeters, both the systolic and the diastolic. And later I'll show you what happens to their numbers as well. Then you have another group which exercises as part of a rehabilitation program for 6 months, about three sessions a week. Even they notice that the blood pressure goes down, both the systolic and the diastolic. And the last lot, which I'm drawing a circle over here, are the people who exercise routinely compared with people who do not, the sedentary individuals. And there's a lot of proof that when you're sedentary, your pressure goes up, both the systolic and the diastolic. Next slide. Okay. Oh dear, let me see if I can remove this. Anyway, I'll leave those circles in place. They were from the previous slide, but yeah, thank you. So what this shows is routine exercise of varying intensity. They're looking at about 1,000 calories in a week. So on an average 1 hour session on a treadmill, you'd probably burn about 300 to 400 calories. So I would say that's about 3 days a week. And you can look at the effect it has here. It increases your good cholesterol. You see that? And it reduces, it increases the HDL, which is your good cholesterol. And the lack of activity actually reduces your HDL. Now, HDL is the good cholesterol as compared to LDL. And there are 3 ways in which people can increase their HDL. I always recommend aerobic exercise as number 1. A glass of red wine once a day is also been shown to increase the HDL, which you want as high as you can get. The last method was the use of a drug called niacin, but there were so many side effects that it's not used anymore. So then you've got the second level of exercise here. It is not so useful with increasing the HDL because this is just 3 sessions of exercise for a limited period of time. So it's the regular exercise that makes the difference. And the next lot is a group of people who have very high frequency exercise, rapid walking, etc. You see, not only does it actually this is the exercisers compared with the people who do not exercise. The sedentary group was found to actually increase their bad cholesterol and reduce their good cholesterol. The LDL actually goes up and the HDL goes down. Next slide, please. Okay, can you remove those? Okay, thank you. So this is a slide I just made up because I'm frequently told by patients when I tell them that, you need to lose a little weight. Now here's listen to this carefully. I say, you need to lose a little weight because your cholesterol or your sugar's gone up a little. And the response I get is that, doctor, I've got bad knees or a bad hip and I can't exercise. So that's why I made this slide, just to show you the calorific content of regular foods we have. So roast turkey breast without skin is 152 calories. The Kit Kat has 218 calories. The Dunkin' Donut, 260. A hamburger, 354. And a hamburger with chips is 881. And these are the calories you burn. All right. To burn 152 calories, which is the same as a slice of roast turkey breast, you need to swim for 13 minutes, jog for 17, cycle for 23, or walk for 42 minutes. So what I tell patients is to burn just a simple Kit Kat. To burn the calories in a Kit Kat, you need to be on the treadmill at about 4 to 5 miles an hour for half an hour. So if you can't do the exercise, you've got to do some reverse logic here and say, if you don't eat the Kit Kat, that's less calories you have to burn. Because exercise is good to tone up. Exercise is good, as I said, to improve a lot of parameters in your physiology of your body. But the prime method by which most of us normal human beings lose weight is diet. If you're an athlete with 2% body fat, you could burn a lot of calories with intense exercise or training, but otherwise it's diet. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to move away from the exercise to the quality of the diet. These are also studies that have been done and appeared in the medical journal, which looks at the incidence of stroke, death from stroke, cardiovascular mortality, and coronary artery disease mortality. And they compared people with less than 1 serving of fruit and vegetables versus 3 servings. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but just to point out, if you go to the extreme right, you'd see the p-value when if it's anything less than 0.05, it's highly significant. And you can see increasing your diet in fruit and vegetables has had significant impact on all of these: the incidence of strokes, the incidence of death from stroke, cardiovascular mortality, and the incidence of mortality from ischemic heart disease. All of that is better with more than 3 portions of fruit and vegetables as a daily diet. Next slide, please. Again, these are the benefits of a plant-based diet. I have to be the full disclosure here. I'm not a vegetarian, but it is like looking at the stars, you know, you never reach them, but you at least know the direction to go in. And that's the purpose of all this. I'm not asking people to become vegetarians, but plant-based diets have been shown again and again to improve glycemic, which is sugar control, improve the lipid profile, and improve the health of your cardiac muscle as well as your vasculature. Plant-based diets. Next slide, please. All right, this is an interesting graph. So on the vertical, you have the hazard ratio for coronary heart disease. And on the horizontal graph, you have 3 different types of plant-based diets, all right? I'm going to explain each one then. PDI, HPDI, and UPDI. So there are 3 lines here. There's this dashed line on top, then there's the dotted line, and then the straight unbroken line. This is just the midpoint. So this line is the healthy plant-based diet. This is a plant-based diet, and that's the unhealthy plant-based diet. So you'd ask me, what is an unhealthy plant-based diet? An unhealthy plant-based diet is like potato chips and sweetened soda and sugary food and drinks, but it's all plant. There's no meat in it. You see, that doesn't help. It increases your incidence of heart disease. That's the unhealthy plant-based diet. But the healthy plant-based diet, which is the straight line right at the bottom, is basically mostly vegetables and plants, mostly raw. And then the regular plant-based diet, I guess, is the salads and things that people eat. Both of them reduce the incidence and the hazards ratio for coronary heart disease. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, can you go back to the previous slides too? Something I want to point out. I want to point this out because it's really important. This group of unfortunate individuals could be vegetarians, but they could be overdosing on the wrong kind of refined carbohydrates with artificial and sugar sweeteners when they have no benefit. I just want to repeat that so people have it clear. Next slide. All right, so again, this is what they call meta-analyses, which they collect data from lots of different studies and put them together. And essentially, they're comparing vegetarians versus omnivores, or people who eat everything. And you can see that in all the mortality and all that, it's all in the benefit of the vegetarian, the people who are majorly vegetarian. The mortality from heart disease and from strokes goes down in the large vegetable diet people. Next slide, please. All right, so in this part, so the natural question I would have would be supplements, vitamins, and whether they really help or not. So I want to go through that a little bit. They have studied this also. So in this series of studies, they're looking at stroke incidence, which is there, cardiovascular disease and stroke. And they've used different supplements. These are the supplements that come in your multivite. It's folic acid and vitamin B complex. And both folic acid and B complex have been shown to reduce the incidence of strokes and cardiovascular deaths. Next slide. The reason I'm doing this is because there is a lot of interest in supplements and vitamins, and I just want to show, these are from the, this is from the article that came out last week. They actually show that as far as heart disease is concerned, not all supplements are equally beneficial, and some can be really bad, and that's what this slide actually shows. So multivitamins actually reduce the incidence of cardiovascular disease. Vitamin D reduces it, but a little bit, and it's not really significant. You see that, look at that p-value. It's actually not less than 0.05. So that's not significant. So it might not make any difference at all. But here's the big surprise. Cardiovascular disease goes up in people who take calcium supplements. The moral of this story is that if you're taking calcium supplements, be sure it's for a bone problem. Do not take it just because you're asked to take it, because there is an increased incidence of cardiovascular disease in people who take calcium supplements. This is from the 2021 Journal of the American College of Cardiology. And vitamin C makes no difference. I know people talk about vitamin C for everything, but it's not been proven for most of those, and definitely not for reducing cardiovascular disease. Next slide, please. All right, this again, it's what I had showed you before. As you can see, multivitamins, which is mainly vitamin D and folic acid, has a small advantage, but it's not huge in this particular study. Vitamin D definitely is not shown to have any major benefit or negative, while calcium, again, looks like it's increasing mortality. Next slide. All right, I'm not going to spend too much. This can be very confusing for people, but just remember there's this line, this vertical line that you can see. Anything on the side that favors control means you're better off not taking the vitamins. Anything on the side that says favors supplement shows that the vitamin works. So the only place where there's a little benefit is for multivitamins and maybe for vitamin C, but it's really mostly in the middle. So, and vitamin D and calcium definitely work against you. Vitamin D, calcium for sure. Okay, next slide. Here again. Again, they were looking at vitamin B complex and folic acid. There is a small advantage. It's not a huge advantage. The p-values are not great here. Vitamin B also has a small advantage. Antioxidants, all that other stuff, and niacin. We talked about niacin earlier, about raising HDL. Definitely not good for you. I just want to summarize. I don't know if I have another slide on this, but before we go forward, I want to summarize. So the point here is that there are very few supplements that make a big difference. Maybe a multivite once a day with folic acid in it, maybe reducing the incidence of stroke. Everything else, I'm not saying you shouldn't take it, but make sure you're taking it for a good reason. It's certainly not to help your cardiovascular or stroke risk. Next slide. This again is from last week's article, and you can see this is the American College of Cardiology. I'm just going to draw your attention to the bottom here. They recommend that if you're taking supplements, then this is to do with the calcium, the bad guy, and vitamin D, which we're not sure is so great either. They recommend that you get it through your natural food sources or have it prescribed by somebody who does it for a really good reason. The point I'm trying to make is this is definitely not something you should be taking willy-nilly just because you think it's good, because there's so much push for vitamin D and calcium. And there are people who have bone problems and need vitamin D, and this does not apply to them. This is just general cardiovascular health. And this is recent, it just came out. Next slide. Yeah, sorry, those annotations are still there, if you can remove those. It's really what they say here. It's more what I said in the last slide, that if you're taking these, make sure you take it for bone health. Make sure you take it because it's recommended that by a person who does it for a specific reason. It's not something you should be taking just across the board. Next slide. All right, I just want to have a few slides here just to tell you the forces that are against you when you're trying to focus on a healthy diet and say a plant-based diet and eat less red meat. This is a slide from 1996, I believe. This is when Oprah Winfrey moved her show to Texas to fight the cattle ranchers there because they sued her because on her show she had some rancher who had turned vegetarian who was talking about mad cow disease, which was very prevalent at the time. And she said this memorable line that I would never eat another burger. And the sales of burgers went down when she said that because she's very famous and she's a very public person. So the cattle ranchers in Texas sued her for it, but she fought it on a First Amendment basis and actually won. And until I read this article recently, I didn't realize that America is one country where some states have anti-defamation laws protecting food. Go figure that out. Next slide. And this is Paula Dean, who had this cooking show with Southern fried food up and down the TV networks until she became diabetic. And then she did a complete turnaround and started working for Novo Nordisk, which is a diabetic medication company. So it was a good career move for her, but I hope people got the right message that her cooking style wasn't the best thing and not to be emulated. And that's Al Roker, who himself had gastric bypass around this time. Next slide, please. All right, so anybody who has not seen this, I'm sure this film is available on Netflix. I recommend you watch it. It's called Forks Over Knives. It's a great film about plant-based diets and how good they're for you. It's quite incredible sometimes when I watch the film, and it's incredible when you watch these huge bodybuilders and all on nothing but plant-based diets. So that's a good movie. Next slide. Now, this is a book that came out a few years ago. This, I think, is the second edition. It's called The China Study, but Colin Campbell and Thomas Campbell are actually researchers from Cornell. Thomas Campbell is a nutritional biochemistry professor at Campbell. He did this study between a scientific group here in America, a group in China, and a group in Oxford. It's a big book, but it goes through the whole connection between eating red meat and the various cancers. It's worthwhile reading. I recommend, if you feel like reading a book, read it in stages because it's quite big, but it addresses all this. Next slide, please. This is another book and another author I recommend very highly, Michael Pollan, and this is his most famous book, In Defense of Food. Worth reading. It's a small book. You should take a look at it, maybe from your local library. Next slide. All right, so there is good news, and I tried to keep this topic in today's talk on a positive thing, because most of us, I believe, are over 50, and I'd hate to think that we are waiting for doomsday. Over the last, the slide is a bit high, I can't see the title. Over the last, I would say 20 years, there has been a decline. No, over the last 110 years, there's actually been a decline in heart disease, and there has been an extension of longevity in the States, which is good news. Next slide, please. Yep, hospital discharges for coronary heart disease also going down in the last 10 years. And in 2020, the commonest cause of death was not heart disease, it was COVID-19. Next slide. I can't see the top of the slide, it's obscured. This is, again, I think this is to do with myocardial infarctions also going down over the years. So it's good news that the incidence of heart disease, we have reached the peak and it is becoming less. When I was in training 20 years ago, it was quite usual to see a heart attack every day, 2 a day sometimes. I remember, because I had to go between hospitals to be there within 1 hour of the heart attack coming in, and we don't see that often. Now you're good if you see 1 a week or even less frequently. So the incidence has gone down. Next slide. All right, I think I'm coming to the end of this talk. So life expectancy has gone up. People are living longer. People are getting healthier. The only problem is that over the last 40,000 years, we got it right up to a point. And then suddenly we started sitting down at these computers and becoming sedentary all over again. So what you should do is lift yourself up and get back to that exercise at least 3 times a week, 1 hour of exercise with 15 minutes of warm-up. That's plenty. Next slide. Oh, I've got one more slide, I think. Yes, this is my last slide, and there's a number there. It's 2,951,769,600. That's not my social security number. That's the number of times your heart would go through the cardiac cycle if you live to the age of 78. Non-stop, this amazing machine will just keep working. It regulates itself and it repairs itself. Even people with bypasses and stents still have the same. All the bypass and the stent does is it opens up the pipes to bring oxygen to that amazing muscle that does all this. And on that note, I'll take any questions.
Okay, let's read some questions. How would I know if I have a blood clot?
The blood clot depends on where you have it. The most likely situation is that you won't know unless it causes trouble. And the way that a blood clot can cause trouble is that it can travel into one of your vessels, the legs, the arteries in the legs, the vessels in the abdomen, or much more seriously, the vessels in the heart or the brain. The commonest blood clot problems that we see are when they go into the pulmonary artery, makes you short of breath. Typical situation is somebody who has been sitting for a long time, like taking a transatlantic flight, sitting in the plane for 8 hours without moving, gets dehydrated, develops a clot, and it goes into the lungs. You can have a blood clot going into the brain, which causes a stroke, and you can have blood clots going into the heart, which cause a heart attack. But you would not know until it has happened.
Have studies been done comparing the Mediterranean diet to plant-based diets without lean meats and fish?
I think that's a great question. I'm sorry, I cannot answer that, but my educated guess is yes, they have looked at it because they're two different diets. And I don't know, I think the jury would be out, but it's, I don't know, but I'm sure the studies have been done.
Okay. If you have osteoporosis and take calcium, is there something else that you would recommend people take instead?
Well, that's the problem, because if you have osteoporosis and you take calcium and vitamin D, you're taking it to maintain your bone density and you need it. So it's the risk versus benefit, right? So you have the benefit of preventing fractures, and it's worthwhile taking the small risks. It's like a person taking aspirin if they have a stent. They can bleed from the stomach, but the benefit of preventing a future heart attack or stroke outweighs the risk of bleeding from the stomach. So that's where I was saying that if anybody is on calcium supplements or vitamin D, just make sure that the person prescribing it to you is doing it for a good reason. Now, if you remember those two slides that I showed from the American College of Cardiology, they would recommend somebody with osteopenia, which is not full osteoporosis, get their calcium and vitamin D from the diet itself. And in which case you're getting it from a natural source rather than purified and concentrated vitamin D. So that's where the decision has to be made by your prescribing doctor. So the answer to it is that I think if you have osteoporosis, you probably need the calcium and you need the vitamin D. There really isn't a suitable alternative as far as I know, but you're justifying it, you're balancing it with the risk versus the benefit that you're getting from it.
Dr. Rohan, have you come across any metadata analysis for Ayurvedic diet, if I'm pronouncing that correctly?
Ayurvedic, yes.
Ayurvedic, which is majorly lacto-vegetarian, but based on body type, and healthy meat is actually okay for certain types of bodies with great digestive power because it is required for that type.
I have to say I'm familiar with the term Ayurvedic, but I'm not familiar with that study, and that's going into the doctoral level of this nutrition discussion. I'm sorry, I can't answer that. Maybe if you looked in the China study, that book, I have the book at home. I haven't read it all. There might be something on that, but sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Another question, do you think that the primary decline in CAD in recent years is due to the wide use of statins?
There is definitely a large possibility that that is a factor. So the statins first came out in the 1980s, like 86. I can't remember. It's around medical school time. The 4S study, which was simvastatin, that showed that's when it started out, right? And the guy who won the Nobel Prize for LDL won it in 1979, I think. His name was Goldstein. So this is relatively recent, but if you look at the trend that I showed you, that starts from 1900s. So yes, it's true that the statin use has made a huge difference. I mean, nobody's going to deny that. And statin use is still very much part of this treatment of lipids and all that. In today's talk, I was trying to stick to everything that you can do on a natural basis, but you'll find out anybody who has anything close to like a stent or a cardiac event will be on statins. And so the answer to your question is yes, you're right. They have made a huge difference in the last, I would say, 20, 30 years. Are you there?
I'm sorry, what is your opinion of fish oil supplements?
You know, I've looked at this, and just like the American college slides I showed you where if they recommend vitamin D or calcium, it's as part of a natural food. The omega-3s and the fish oil supplements as part of eating fish to a certain extent regularly, so many times a week, is definitely undoubtedly good for you, and it's been shown to be good for you. The omega-3 supplements have again fallen along the middle of those tables I showed you, where some studies show benefits, some show they have not shown any adverse effects, except for maybe in some people diarrhea because of intolerance of the oil, but no real cardiovascular, unlike the calcium and the increase in strokes and all that. It hasn't shown anything like that. But you'll find out most of the organizations and the professional bodies recommend it as part of a balanced diet, not as an extra supplement, although the supplements are all around.
Another question, is there any way to improve aortic stenosis?
Wow, yeah, I didn't go into that. And while I was going through these slides, I saw exercise and diet and reduced calcification, but that has not been proven. They have tested Lipitor and some other statins against the aortic valve stenosis, thinking that there'll be less, because what happens is the valve gets stiff and then it gets calcified. So they're trying to prevent the calcium coming on there. And then people also ask me, if you take calcium supplement, does it go and sit on your aortic valve? No, it doesn't happen like that either. But the fact is that there hasn't been any obvious methods by which you can reduce aortic stenosis. So that's why when I started this talk, I said most of the preventable measures we can take are all aimed at CAD, not at valvular heart disease. Because, I mean, someday people are going to find out that's something to do, but not yet.
Speaking of valves, another question. If you have a leaky valve or two, does that make you more prone to heart attack?
Absolutely not. Having said that, if you have an extremely leaky aortic valve, because the way the heart works, you can have backflow directing blood away from the coronary arteries. You won't have a heart attack, but you will have angina with very, very severe aortic valve leakage. But when it gets to that level, your doctor or your cardiologist would have recommended you have it replaced. But the answer to the question is no. Leaky valves do not cause heart attacks at all.
Okay, here's a timely question. Can someone come up with cardiac problems after taking the COVID vaccine if they already have autoimmune issues and high cholesterol?
It's a good question. I would think not. If you balance the taking the COVID vaccine versus getting COVID. Now, it is known that when you get COVID, you can get inflammation of the heart muscle and you can get blood clots, making you have heart attacks and strokes. That's well known now, which is why when you go in the hospital with COVID, if you're short of breath, they're going to put you on a blood thinner like heparin and steroids and things. On the other hand, the vaccination, which works on your immune system to boost up your immunity and build up the immunity against the virus, per se, I do not know of, I've not read of, and none of the cardiac journals ever mentions that getting the vaccine worsens any kind of heart condition. What happens with and people might have heard this term, it's called the cytokine storm. So the mortality from COVID is only about 2%. Of 100 people getting COVID, only 2 people will die. But the ones that do are victims of that huge immune response to the COVID virus, which is called the cytokine storm, and that causes them to form blood clots all over the body, damages the heart and the brain and the lungs, and everything turns to mush. It's a strange thing that happens very rarely, but when it happens, it's quite serious and fatal. The vaccine I have not read anything in any of the journals, and I've not seen any reports of the vaccine itself causing any problems. So if the question behind the question is whether you should take the vaccine, even if you have some degree of heart disease, I would say definitely do. You would actually come on the on a higher category as being eligible for it.
Another viewer asks, my HDL is 40, yet I exercise every day 30 minutes minimum. What can I do to increase my HDL? Do you recommend Prevestatin for long term?
HDL elevation per se with the statins, of which Prevestatin is one, is actually very small. As I mentioned earlier, the red wine has been shown to increase HDL. I'm not telling you to drink a bottle a day, but a glass with dinner definitely does. Or the black grape juice, which has the resveratrol, which has the skin of the grape, that's shown to increase HDL. Aerobic of half an hour may not be enough. Maybe you need an hour. I mean, I tell everybody who exercises to do about 55 minutes with maybe a 5-minute break in between. You need to get your heart rate up and keep it up for enough time to stimulate all the different physiological parameters. As far as medicines, the only medicine that wasn't shown has been shown to increase HDL was niacin, and it came in a form called niaspan. But that was taken off the market about 5 years ago. And I showed you one slide where it increases other adverse cardiac events. So it's not recommended anymore. So it's really red wine and aerobic exercise.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions. What are the options for treating moderate to severe mitral valve prolapse?
It depends on whether the regurgitation is moderate to severe. So this obviously has to be run by your cardiologist for the person asking the question, but they would want to see whether your chambers are getting dilated on the echocardiogram or whether they're holding their size and not getting bigger, which is a good sign. But the more important parameter for getting it fixed would be to see if it's causing symptoms. So I tell patients to have a regular workout routine that you could do, say walk 2 miles on flat ground. And if you suddenly wake up and you can't do more than 10 yards, you get short of breath, that's time to go and see your cardiologist. Maybe it's time to fix it. And I also want to add that now there's about 3 different places here in Long Island which offers mitral valve clips. You don't actually have to have open heart surgery. But it has to be decided by your cardiologist and whether the time is right or not.
Okay, one more question here. What are the latest meds to treat AFib with minimum side effects?
Well, when you're talking about treating AFib, there's 2 aspects to it. One is to prevent a stroke because of a blood clot forming because your heart is in fibrillation. For that, the most recent medications are what we call the NOACs, such as the Eliquis, the Xarelto, and the Pradaxa, that group, dabigatran, Pradaxa. There's 3 of them. The older drug was warfarin to keep the blood thin. So that's to treat the blood clot formation. So that's one arm of the AFib problem. The other arm is to control the rhythm and make you back in sinus. There are about 3 or 4 drugs available. None of them is very effective. The best is about 50 or 60% effective. But the ablation for AFib has become extremely effective now. And there's a very high success rate with it. So if somebody has tried medicines and they remain in AFib, the thing to do would be to talk to your cardiologist and consider ablation, which is now it's a lot more. When I was in training, it was only about 70% effective. Now it's reaching about 80 to 85% effect, which means 85 out of 100 people going for ablation will be cured forever and will never have to think about taking blood thinners or anything. You have to discuss this with your cardiologist.
Great. Dr. Pereira, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or your question wasn't answered, you can email them to us at matherhospital@northwell.edu. Also, once you exit the webinar, you will see a link to complete a brief survey. If you would please complete that survey, your feedback is extremely important to us and helps us plan future programs. Again, thank you all for joining us today. And if you would like to view this webinar or other HealthyU webinars, you can find them at matherhospital.org/HealthyU. And this recording will be up on our website probably by next week. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Stu and Emily.